Recently, we were given the opportunity to travel to Los Angeles to play Armored Core 6 in person, hands-on with FromSoftware and Bandai Namco. And not only that, we were given the opportunity to pilot a real-life mech, which was pretty cool. And in this video, I want to go over our impressions from that event and tell you what we think about Armored Core 6 so far and what you can expect when the game comes out next month on August 25th. Before we get into it, though, one thing I want to note is that you're going to see a lot of gameplay from that event today. This gameplay is our own captured gameplay. This is from our playthrough. So if you've watched other Armored Core 6 videos, this is not the same gameplay or the same B-roll, divvied up 100 times. This is actually our specific gameplay we are playing in this footage, as you can tell from our red mech that has our Fix for Life logo on it. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk a bit about is the length of this game and what we got to play. So we got to play the first 11 missions of the full version of the game. You won't see all of those missions here because we were not allowed to show some of them, but you will see about half of those missions. And it took me about just under 3 hours or so to get through those 11 missions. And what's really intriguing about that to me is that we were told that the game would be around 50 to 60 hours long, which means that your mission count by the time you complete this game is probably going to be over 100 missions. I wouldn't expect it to be, exactly the same. You're not going to multiply it by, 20 and get a number that's accurate, because the missions are getting longer and longer as you go. And I expect the missions later in the game to be even longer. So I think the overall mission count is going to slow down and, progress into something with longer missions. But even still, that's a lot of missions to this game. Now, I did spend quite a bit of my time tinkering with my mech, making it look how I want and, engaging in pre- and post-mission dialogues. And I expect the post- and pre-mission dialogues to continue pretty heavily throughout the game, because that's where you get a lot of the game's story. There are cutscenes, obviously.
Gen 4s can be emotionally withdrawn. They need a shot in the arm every now and then.
And you got a deal. I'll send Volt and Iguazu.
But there's a lot of background information and kind of direction on what you're doing in that dialogue. But I think the amount that you're going to be tinkering with your mech will probably slow down over time as you dial in exactly what you want to do. So I think the vast majority of your game time at some point is just going to be engaging in missions, just going into missions, like finishing a mission, going back into a mission quickly as possible. So you're going to have a lot of gameplay hours compared to the other bits, I think. And I will say the bit of dialogue that I have heard so far in the 3 hours that I played was very well done. I actually enjoyed the dialogue. I think it was very accurate. The characters felt like the right voice for the style of character they were portraying. And maybe the one negative to this, I would say, is that sometimes it just felt like these dialogues went on a very, very long time. And, particularly at the beginning of the game, when you're just really itching to get back into combat and learn more about how the game plays, and you just want to see more rockets flying out and guns firing, you have a tendency to have to sit there for a bit and really listen to these dialogues. And you can skip these dialogues if you want, but I was really trying to get the background story of the game and really learn some things about Armored Core 6. So I sat there through this, but I think as a new player, you're probably going to want to get back into combat faster. And so I think the dialogues run a little long, particularly early on. I don't think it's going to be as much of an issue later in the game, but early on in the game, I wish they had been a little bit shorter. It's nitpicky, I know, but it's just a little detail. So the general flow of the game has you preparing for your mission by, changing your mech in any way that you would like. That's possible, depending on what you have so far. And as you complete more and more missions, you gain more and more funds in order to be able to buy more parts that you can further customize your mech with. Pretty standard for a mech game. And then once you've readied up for your mission and selected the one that you want to go on, you're going to get a debrief on what your objective is for that mission. And then you load into the mission and begin. Usually missions kind of follow this format, at least larger missions, where you start out in a big open outdoor area, have some objectives. And then as the mission progresses, you kind of go into a more indoor confined space that's more Souls-like-ian, if you will, where there's less verticality to it than the outdoor space and more, horizontal mobility in fights. That's not always the case, but that's just generally what tends to happen on the larger missions. Sometimes you never go into an indoor space and it's all outdoors, and sometimes your missions are just indoor spaces or like a boss or something like that. And then once you've finished the mission objectives, you will go back to base and you'll load back, and then you'll have a debrief on how things went, and kind of sometimes you'll get some foreshadowing maybe on what's going to happen next. If any major events happen while you're out on mission, they're usually told through cutscenes. We can't really show you some of those cutscenes here because they have a lot of story spoilers. But let's just say that there is an overall arcing plot that this game follows that's going to be the driving narrative for it while you go from mission to mission. So you have your flavor of the week, if you will, in your mission-to-mission gameplay, and that's telling the story of that mission. but there is an overarching plot that's being accomplished as you move through the game. So getting into the actual combat, the meat of the gameplay of this, besides the tinkering with your mechs, the controls obviously feel very good. FromSoftware is famous for their smooth gameplay and controls. That translates very, very well here with Armored Core 6. It feels like your mech is doing almost exactly what you want to do. I'd say maybe a couple % of the time it felt like I overshot things, and that's probably just my learning curve of the game. But the controls feel really good overall, and that's something that's really important when you're flying a million miles an hour around and you're fighting at really, really high speeds. So thankfully, the controls of the game feel really good. And I will say that something I noticed early on in this game, very early, is that the skill ceiling for this game feels much higher than the Souls games. I mean, we've seen some incredible things from Souls players over the time, but I think the things that a good Armored Core player will be able to do in this game are going to exceed even those of a Dark Souls player. There is just so many cool things you can do in this game that mastering will take a very long time to do for the average player, that if you're an excellent player at this game, you're not only going to be zooming around killing everything, but you're going to look like an absolute badass while you're doing it, like in a style that's completely well above Dark Souls or Elden Ring. And in terms of things you're doing in missions, you're usually like taking out another mech, or maybe you're destroying like a battery of the enemy or taking out one of their bases. They have these typical mech missions where sometimes you're like piloting a mech as a wingman for another mech or a series of mechs, and there's like a lot of things happening on the screen and you're sort of running cover for them. Had this really nostalgic feeling to me. I haven't played a mech game in a really long time, and it kind of took me back to the Mech Warrior games I used to play when I was a kid, and I really, really enjoyed that aspect. And I spent a lot of time tinkering with my mech. I painted my mech, I put decals on my mech, but I also swapped parts in and out, different legs in and out, different generators in and out, different weapons, trying them out. I wanted to see like how, competitive is every weapon set? Like, is every weapon set as good as every other weapon set? Or are there definitively better combinations than others? And I will say, after playing for 3 hours, which is, again, not a huge amount of time, it does seem that there are weapons that are distinctly better than others on average, in my opinion. It didn't take me that long to like really hone in on what was working for me and what wasn't. And I expect this to change probably somewhat throughout the game as you get more equipment. But generally speaking, it did feel like there were things that worked better than others. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well. For instance, melee is extremely strong in this game, and honestly, it should be. You have to get point blank to the enemy or pretty close, because your mech will actually pull you forward into an attack animation before you can attack them. And one particularly strong thing about melee is that enemies have like a stagger gauge in this game, not unlike Sekiro, where once you stagger them, they're vulnerable for a few seconds, and they take full damage. Their defenses don't come into account, and they just sit there while you can blow them apart with your weapons. And melee is a huge way that you can accomplish this easily and build up stagger very, very quickly. I also found that like using a bazooka on my right-hand weapon made it so that after I did this melee combo, I could just fire that bazooka point blank into the enemy before they could move. And that would often like completely fill up their stagger gauge if they were close. And then I could melee attack again and just kind of keep repeating this pattern. This is what I did to the final boss on level or mission 11. And it actually allowed me to beat it first try. I was just hyper aggressive with melee and, my bazooka. And once it was staggered, I would just unload my rockets into it and just kind of keep repeating this pattern. So I do feel like you will have a build that works for you. I'm not trying to say there are not other builds that would work, but I found the one that worked for me. And I do think players will each have their definitive style, but I also think there will probably be meta builds in this game that work better than others. No surprise there. So then let's talk mech customization. You will spend some time customizing your mech in this game, and I feel like as the game goes on, you'll probably spend less and less time doing this as you find a setup that works for you. But particularly at the beginning of the game, you're going to spend time changing legs, changing weapons, and every time you get new legs and new weapons and new cores and stuff, you're obviously going to want to try these things out. But there's a lot to it when you start really diving into the customization. For instance, there are just a lot of stats on these weapons when you first look at them that you're not going to understand exactly what they do unless you are super familiar with Armored Core. And as a new player, you're going to be like, what does all this mean? And you need to spend some time really understanding that. We might do a video on this at launch, sort of explaining these just to help ease people into it. It's not super necessary to understand these things, mind you, because you can just make your mech and go into combat and you're fine. But I do think as you get further and further into the game and the difficulty starts ramping up, understanding just exactly what you're gaining and what you're losing by each piece is going to go a long way for you to perfecting your mech. Like, you still might have a good mech and not know these things, but you might have a much, much better mech if you do. And lastly, I want to talk a bit about the graphics of the game. This is kind of a sore point for me. The graphics of this game are serviceable, no doubt, But the game is made for last gen and this gen consoles. And so I think you're going to see it once again, the graphics of this game suffer, kind of the way Elden Ring's graphics suffered. Obviously, no one cares about the graphics of Elden Ring, right? Like, the game is good. It's phenomenal. Graphics are not the most important thing for Elden Ring. But I kind of feel like in a mech game, graphics are a little more important. Like, you want the combat to be as flashy as possible, as visually as appealing as possible. And I feel like you're starting to notice how dated FromSoftware's engine is getting in Armored Core 6. I mean, gameplay-wise, the game ran smooth. I was up above 60 FPS the whole time. There were no bugs. There were no glitches. There were no crashes. Everything ran great. And we've come to expect this from FromSoftware. They typically don't have these issues in their games at launch, so that's really good news. But I do wonder, at what point are they going to make the leap to a new engine like Unreal 5? I mean, they are falling further and further behind the industry by using this antiquated engine. And I wonder at what point are people going to quit forgiving it? You know what I mean? Like, they do so many good things in their games, and graphics are not everything. But I feel like graphics are a huge part of a mech game compared to something like Elden Ring. And they got to make that jump at some point, and I wonder when we're going to see it. Obviously, Elden Ring DLC is going to still be on the Elden Ring engine. But what about the games after that? Are they going to move away from the engine that they've been using, or are they going to continue to use this because it's what they know and what works for them? I think time will tell on that, but I really, really hope at some point they're able to make the jump to a more modern engine. All in all, I really enjoyed my time playing Armored Core 6. It was a ton of fun to play. I haven't played a mech game in a really long time, and FromSoftware's controls make it really easy to get into and familiar for those of you with the Souls franchise or Elden Ring. It should be fairly easy for you to pick up. A lot of the controls feel very, very, muscle memory similar to those games, so you should be able to jump right into it easily. Those things said, though, it's going to be a tall order to peel people away from Baldur's Gate 3, which I think will likely win Game of the Year, or from Starfield, or from Lies of P, or from Lords of the Fallen, to play this game heavily. I think the people that are historically fans of FromSoftware and Dark Souls and Elden Ring are going to be playing a lot of those games. And I don't see a lot of them making the jump to Armored Core 6 immediately to play it on release. I can see them more getting through all those games and then picking up Armored Core maybe this winter when they've gotten through them all, or maybe, in the spring of next year where they're waiting for the Elden Ring DLC if it's not out by then. But I don't know how many people are going to jump off those games to play this game. And frankly, from what I've seen so far, it would be tough for me to do as well. So what do you guys think so far from seeing the gameplay? Is Armored Core something that you want to play as an Elden Ring or Dark Souls fan because it's made by FromSoftware? Or mech games just not really your jam? I love mech games. I played Chrome Hounds by FromSoftware. It was definitely one of my favorite mech games that I played, besides the early Mech Warrior games. But this summer, the timing with it, I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.